right, so I'm going to start now. So I decided to call my project Taste It for the Culture, which I took from a TikToker called Jackie Cho. And when he cooks his recipes on TikTok, he also always says midway through, taste it for the culture, because he cooks very culturally significant food for him. So that I was inspired a little bit by him for this project. And my collaborator is Cabramatta Intensive English Centre, which is the school that I work at. And all the students at the school are all newly arrived Australians, whether it be that they're refugees, international students, or migrants. So all of their languages in terms of English is still in the developmental phase. So this project is targeted at teachers at the school and also those students. So the goals and outcomes of the project, there are two, and they're linked quite closely together. So the first one is to assist teachers in designing effective online learning materials for EALD students, where EALD means English as an additional language or dialect. And the second goal, which is informed by this, is to provide EALD students with quality online learning in lieu of face-to-face classroom learning. So why this kind of project came about? Due to the impact of COVID-19 on schools in New South Wales, particularly last term, all schools had to move on to online learning in various forms. And Cabramatta High School and Intensive English Centre delivered their online learning through Google Classroom. There was so little time to prepare for this, so teachers had 2 days to turn all their face-to-face learning materials into online learning materials, and also to actually learn how to use Google Classroom and other materials such as Google Hangouts or Zoom to deliver content. Both teachers and students were very unfamiliar with how to use Google Classroom initially, which was a huge problem both for teachers and students trying to engage in the online learning. The students were expected to complete online activities for all their classes. Each student, depending on their level, has about 10 classes a week that they do. And they had a face-to-face online lesson with a teacher once a week. And this project was primarily targeted at the teachers who need support in this aspect, as not all of the teachers who work at the school are EALD trained or very familiar with how to deliver learning in an online context. So the significance of this project: online learning can be difficult even in the best of circumstances. Put into context, going through a pandemic makes it even more difficult, both for teachers and students. Teachers consistently need support to ensure that the materials are suitable for the students that they're delivering it to, and appropriate for students' learning abilities and interests as well. This is a strong belief of mine that all students deserve to have access to quality online learning regardless of their circumstances. So this was very important in this project. And this project has identified that there is a gap in the availability of or access to teacher professional development, both in terms of delivering online content for EALD learners and just technology use in general. So when I did the lit review for this project, I looked at 5 kind of broad content areas. The first was the access to professional learning and development for teachers teaching in EALD context. The second was how do EALD students best learn online. And then I kind of broadly went more to how is online learning best delivered through technology use in education, how to do some lesson or unit design for EALD learners. A lot of that literature I'm familiar with because I've been teaching now for a couple of years in this context, but it was a really good refresher to go through. And this final one was decolonized approaches to education, which I already kind of implement a little bit in my teaching, but was really inspired by some of the content in Amar's lectures about making sure that this was a very embedded part of my project as well. So the alignment between my design and goals. So the first thing that I kind of was looking at is I need to research and note specific issues that teachers were having in using Google Classroom. So that meant actually talking to the teachers that I work with and my colleagues and finding out what difficulties they had. I needed to research and understand the pedagogical approaches to online learning because they're constantly changing and fluctuating with technology use and development. So I needed to really keep on top of that. I needed to create a concept of a lesson that embodied all 5 material senses, had cross-curriculum content, was multimodal, and involved activities appropriate for EALD learners. And this particular point is very much informed by the research that I was going through and reviewing at the time of this project. From there, I needed to design a lesson in a lesson plan format that the teachers that I work with would be familiar with, and then design the model materials, which was the thing 2. So the model materials is actually about, I think, 8 or 9 of them. So thing 1 is kind of one big lesson plan for a unit, and thing 2 involves lots of other little sub things. And then the second goal was more focusing on designing the model materials, because by having good model materials, the teachers know the best way to deliver the content, and therefore the students are getting the most out of their learning. There were some challenges that I faced. Time restraint was a huge thing. I had to work around a lot of the teachers and the students. There was some reluctance from students to participate in this, and a lot of that had to do with consent for recording, which I was not able to do, unfortunately, because there's such strict kind of rules with New South Wales schools and consent and recording students for research purposes. And ensuring that the lessons were appropriate for students. I'm not very familiar with them because I have taken this year off on leave to study. So I had to get to know them a little bit to kind of overcome that challenge. One negative consequence was I didn't want to come across as patronizing to teachers. A lot of my colleagues have been working for decades, and I didn't want to feel like I was coming across telling them how to teach. So I had to carefully consider their skills and expertise when designing the lesson. Not all students are going to find my lessons engaging, so I had to try to make them feel not obligated to participate if it wasn't something that they really wanted to do, as this wasn't a lesson that was part of their regular learning outcomes. And how was I going to address students who encountered difficulties in the lesson? I had to make sure that they had access to anything they needed to complete it. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the project materials. So I did a breakdown of how they kind of relate to the 5 material senses for both, but I'd rather talk about that when looking at the actual materials. So can I just confirm with a heads up that everyone can see this new screen? Yep, perfect. Okay, so this was my lesson plan. So the first page relates to the learning outcomes, the unit description, and all these sorts of things. So my colleagues would know exactly what to do if they were given this unit outline. Some of the feedback that I got in the tutorials was, can a teacher pick this up and use it? So how I overcame that is I showed it to my colleagues and I got their input saying, okay, if I was to put the 8 Aboriginal ways of learning, would you actually understand what this means? Which meant that I had to put these kind of explanations here just to make sure that they were familiar with what it actually meant. So the lessons themselves involved students cooking a meal that is significant for them and following a recipe. So this particular material here for the first lesson was inspired by what Amma kind of talked about with me in one of our consultations, which was looking at how food or recipes are not just something that you make. It can be something that involves science, it can involve history, it can involve culture. So what I wanted to do with this material is to get students to kind of understand those sorts of concepts and relate it back to how that would be significant for them. I then gave them a little homework task. This is not what it usually looked like. It was actually a Google form, but I just converted it to a PDF. I gave them an ingredients list of the meal that we would be cooking together. I then got them to do a little bit of homework based on what we cooked. So we cooked this meal together. It's called Hobbs Bazate. It's a Maltese food that I grew up eating. We cooked it together. Then their homework was to do some vocabulary activities, which is here. And then I gave them a model recipe. So we cooked together without a recipe, just with my guidance. And then they actually were given a model one for them to then create themselves. So here's my template model of how they could make their own. This was an example of one that a student made themselves. So they made a traditional Iraqi dish, which is similar to arancini. So you can see that it looks quite similar to mine with the end product because they had a lot of support. Just quickly to wrap up, this was the next part of the lesson, which was they had to describe what they made through the 5 material senses and reflect on how it was important to them. So this was my model of why Hobbs Fazate is significant to my culture and history. This was a template students used to create their own, and this was the final product. So just to wrap up, I also reflected on how my project fit the credible criteria. And I'm going to wrap up by just asking for whoever wants to give me feedback, which of these criteria, if at all, do you think my project kind of fits the most? Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up there and stop sharing my, actually I'll leave that there. So does anyone want to give me feedback about whether you think my project itself is actually credible?
Anyone? What do you guys think? Credible?
Yeah, about Reagan's teaching plan, I love it. We have a teaching plan too, but because she is a real teacher in reality, so so her job has high participation, and I think a lot of things can inspire us to improve our teaching plan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bella.
Yeah, and in terms of, does anyone else want to answer Reagan's question in terms of her project itself? Do you guys think it meets the criteria for a credible project?
No one?
That's all right. The reason why I wanted to ask is that I feel like when you design something and you're looking at it from this perspective, it's very easy for you to justify why it might meet that criteria. So I think for me, I can reflect on it and I can say, yes, it meets all this criteria. But what I was more interested in is, do other people feel that way?
You know what? I will save that as a discussion for the end, because I think that's something that's relevant to not just your project as well, but to what everyone has done. So we'll leave it as a discussion towards it because I'm pretty sure we'll have time. So we'll come back to that, Reagan, and people can also just weigh in on what they thought about other people's projects as well. So yeah, okay, well done on that.